Well, good morning, and can I welcome everyone to this, the 25th meeting of the Public Audit Committee in 2025. We received apologies this morning from Joe Fitzpatrick, and so can I welcome Keith Brown, who is substituting for Joe Fitzpatrick this morning. Agenda item 1 on the committee's agenda is to decide whether or not to take agenda items 3 and 4 this morning in private. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you very much. And the second item on our agenda is further consideration of the Auditor General's report, NHS in Scotland, Spotlight on Governance. And I'm very pleased to welcome in this session our witnesses this morning. First of all, Ian Bruce, who's the Ethical Standards Commissioner. Good morning. And alongside Mr. Bruce is Melanie Stronach, who's the Public Appointments Manager at the Commissioner for Ethical Standards in Public Life in Scotland. Good morning, Melanie. I understand, Mr. Bruce, you don't have an opening statement and you'd like us to go straight into questions. Is that correct?
If that's acceptable, Convener. Simply to say, as ever, I welcome the opportunity to talk about the work of the office. I have Melanie Stronach here with me today, and if it's acceptable to yourself and the members, I may ask Melanie just to intervene on the odd occasion where she feels additional information and some of the granular detail may be of assistance to the committee in its deliberations.
Yeah, I mean, I presume, Ms. Stronach, your job role is oversight of these public appointments, which is the thing that we're discussing this morning. So, yes, it is. Yeah, right, good. I wonder then, Mr. Bruce, perhaps if you could provide us with a bit more detail about your role in regulating public appointments.
Certainly. The Public Appointments Commissioner for Scotland was established in 2003 by virtue of an Act of the Scottish Parliament. It established the role of Commissioner. I am to publish a code of practice for the making of public appointments, which ministers and their officials are expected to follow. I'm also expected to publish a diversity strategy for the boards of Scotland's public bodies, and I've done some work on that recently, which I hope we may turn to later. I investigate complaints that appointments to the boards of public bodies have not been made in accordance with the code of practice, and I report to the Parliament in instances where the code hasn't been adhered to in a material regard. But I also promote compliance with the code of practice, and I do that using a team of public appointments advisors. So they're experts in recruitment and selection, with a particular focus on diversity, equality and inclusion. It may help the members to understand the way in which I fulfil my role. The legislation is quite dry, but I view myself very much as a supportive regulator. I oversee appointments to the boards of over 100 of Scotland's public bodies, some of the most significant in Scotland, and in the region of 800 roles, chairs and board members. I oversee appointments of chairs and non-executive board members. They spend a significant proportion of the Scottish budget, and they in turn provide strategic leadership, scrutiny and oversight of the work of those public bodies. So it's vitally important that the right people are in those roles. I don't operate as an audit type body, so I allocate people to oversee appointment rounds on the basis of a number of factors. And the intention of that is to assist the Scottish ministers and their officials to get it right. So non-compliance with the code is vanishingly rare, and it's absolutely about getting the right outcome for these boards. So that's the way in which I fulfil my role. I hope that assists.
Yeah, but and how would you respond to the accusation that it's the same old people on the Quango gravy train that keep popping up all the time?
I'm not sure that's entirely true. So we're very, very transparent about the work that we do, and we do publish in our annual report each year the identities, well, not the identities, but the number of people who've applied for the first time, the number of people who've been appointed for the first time. So I certainly wouldn't say it's always the same old faces. You could argue that there's an element of that. So I and you will understand that certain individuals have served on more than one board, and that's certainly been the case during my 20 years in this field of regulating appointments. I think the process could be opened up to more individuals and more people could be encouraged to apply. In respect of those who have held multiple roles, I suppose my only view would be, have they done a good job? You know, are they being appointed because they've been successful in that role? And perhaps it's the case that ministers feel that potentially they have a safe pair of hands and that's the appropriate person for the role. That would certainly be my view, that the whole process is set up to appoint the people who meet the person specifications set by the Scottish ministers.
But are you a kind of gatekeeper over who gets through the sieving process? Who's in the pool of people that can be sought to serve as board members of these public bodies?
So, in order to comply with the Code of Practice, the fundamental principle there is the principle of merit. So, in order for people to be appointed to the role, they need to meet the criteria for selection set by the appointing minister at the outset of an appointment round. Now, you're talking about a sieving process. The code doesn't dictate the process that has to be used, but generally speaking, they do tend to go for written applications, and then there's a shortlisting process. And those that survive the shortlisting process and go through to the next stage of assessment, which is usually an interview, are those who meet those criteria for selection most closely.
OK, but again, can I just understand, are you involved in the shortlisting process?
So I provide oversight of the shortlisting process using public appointments advisors. So if they feel that someone's being taken forward to interview and they aren't as meritorious as the other applicants who've applied, then that in effect would represent non-compliance with the code.
But do you have a right of veto?
Well, I don't have a right of veto, but what I do say is, Scottish ministers are ultimately responsible for these appointments, and that responsibility is devolved to the chair of the selection panel, who's usually the sponsor and the senior civil servant. If one of my advisors identifies that the code is not going to be complied with, and and potentially in a material regard, because if someone's being fundamentally treated unfairly by this process, that would be material non-compliance. They are obliged to write to the responsible person. They're obliged to copy me in. They are obliged to let the responsible person know why they feel that the code isn't being complied with. And the responsible person is told that these are the options that you have in order to bring this round back into compliance. If they choose not to, then I become involved, and that means me getting in contact directly with that senior civil servant, potentially with the minister. And if they insist on pursuing that course of action, that would end up with my reporting to Parliament. I also have the powers to halt an appointment round until such time as Parliament has considered the matter. So you'll understand that civil servants take the advice that I give in this area very seriously.
OK, but just going to the system, if the people in charge of the public appointments process really are the sponsorship team in a civil service department, a directorate general, isn't one of the roles of these people as public appointees to challenge the sponsor division as well as the public body that they are appointed to? And so isn't there a danger that their individuals that might be more challenging will not get through the process because the civil servants involved in that process don't want that?
I think it's, if you'll forgive me, convener, a bit more nuanced than that. So usually in the person specification for non-executive members, and I think rightly so, the ability to constructively challenge is part of the person specification. So they wouldn't be considered suitable if they weren't able to demonstrate that ability. In terms of the challenge function of non-executives, I would suggest it's not necessarily challenging towards the sponsors, who are, and rightly should be, separate from the body itself, which is meant to be arm's length. These people are being sought and appointed to these boards in order that they can challenge the executive team. of that public body, as opposed to the sponsors who sit, quite rightly, separately from it.
Okay. Just a final question from me before we get into some of the more detailed points around how this works in the National Health Service. I mean, so the NHS governance arrangements have been the subject of the spotlight of this report, and indeed we'll speak to the Chief Executive of the NHS later on this morning. Do you have any plans to use your powers of audit and review to look at how things are working in the National Health Service in Scotland?
Yes, we've already undertaken some work because a particular concern, well, a couple of pieces of work that may be of interest to the committee. So I'm concerned about the failure rate for NHS chair appointments in particular. I think that's very, very concerning. When I introduced the new code, and it is only 3 years old, I introduced it in 2022 and had quite a long run-in time before it had to be implemented. But I required the officials who were running these processes to provide a report at the conclusion of each appointment round, and that had to articulate properly reasons for both success but also for failure. So I've been analysing the results of all of those reports. They're not just provided to me, they're also provided to the Minister, because I think the Minister has a role here in holding officials to account if they're not delivering against ministerial ambitions. So on the back of that piece of research we did, I provided some feedback to the government and said, you know, here are the reasons that your own people have identified for failure. What are you going to do in order to address that? So, you know, that's a strand of work. The other piece of work that we were engaged in, and I'd hoped our report would have been published by now, but it's currently sitting in draft with the Scottish Government, was looking at time commitment and remuneration for chairs and board members of public bodies. Things have changed a lot since I started in public appointments, and these roles are very, very significant, and they carry a very, very significant amount of responsibility, and all of this happens in the public eye. And if, as I say, things have changed quite significantly, and the roles have become increasingly difficult to fulfil, challenging to fulfil, might be a better way of putting it. So I thought it was important for us to do a review of whether or not the time commitment that's stated in PACS was sufficient for people to fulfil those roles. Whether or not they felt remuneration was appropriate, because clearly they need to attract people for them, and if there's a high failure rate, then potentially that may be a factor. And I also wanted to look at board culture and how people felt about fulfilling the roles, because given the other hat I wear in respect of investigating complaints about board members, etc., I feel civility in public life is quite important, and incivility potentially could be putting off people as well. So that's another piece of research that I've conducted. Over and above that, I mentioned the State of the Nation report, I think, which is, you know, what we've just looked at. We first published a diversity strategy in 2008, and we've looked at all the changes that have happened societally, etc. Since that time. We are now looking to develop some proposals, and I would genuinely welcome the committee's views in this area, because you're the Public Audit Committee, and you know what works well for governance and what causes things to go wrong. So I think there's a very clear link between diversity on boards, good governance, cognitive diversity in the main, and good governance, and a very clear link to public sector reform. And I think this came through, clearly I've read the papers for today's meeting, but in the Auditor General's report and the spotlight on governance, are they really doing enough in terms of searching for people who are capable of innovating, collaborating, ensuring that community engagement, etc., is meaningful? So all of these things, I think, can be achieved by looking at the wider public appointment system and thinking about how things might be done differently to the way in which they're being done at the moment. So, yes.
OK, thanks. I'm going to move things along by inviting Graham Simpson to put some questions to you. Graham.
Thanks very much, Convener. So you've got oversight of over 100 bodies and 800 roles, you said earlier.
I think it's 770 at the last count.
Right, around about 800.
101 bodies, precisely,
okay.
Yeah.
So do you look at the short list for every one of those roles?
No. No. So the way in which I operate, one could call it risk-based, but I, as well as providing a code of practice, I also provide statutory guidance on its application. And the statutory guidance includes all the factors that I look at to determine what level of oversight I'm going to provide for a particular appointment round. To give you a reductive example, any NHS chair appointment round, I provide full oversight. So yes, I would have someone looking at the shortlisting process for those, but there will be quite a number of other bodies' appointments to which I only provide oversight, perhaps at the start, when we're looking at succession planning, which I think there really ought to be more focus on, or I can provide oversight of that stage and the planning stage. I can extend that to the stages of assessment as well, but a whole range of factors set out in the statutory guidance that I take into account, things like the budget of the body, its responsibilities, the level of public interest, whether or not there's been a Section 22 report. So, you know, as part of our briefing for our advisors, they need to know the context that that public body is operating in order to provide advice and guidance to those who are looking to fulfil these roles and ensure they're looking for the right people at the right time.
Okay. So you look at the shortlist for every health board chair.
Yes.
Do you have the power to step in and halt a process?
Yes.
Have you ever done that?
So, yes, to an extent, but only to the extent I've said, this looks like non-compliance with the code. Are you going to bring it into compliance? And as I explained earlier to the convener, if they don't, then potentially that's a report to Parliament. And believe me, officials wish to avoid that.
So where was that, out of interest?
I'm not sure it would be appropriate for me.
Can you tell us what, you know, how was that process, wherever it was, non-compliant?
So, so seeking to take someone forward to the next stage of the process where that person was not as meritorious as other applicants for a role would be an example.
Okay. And what happened in that case?
The official undertook to do the appropriate thing, which was to shortlist those who were most meritorious, as opposed to taking forward someone who didn't meet the criteria for selection to the same extent as the others, which would be fundamentally unfair. So
that's essentially you saying, well, actually, that person shouldn't be going through.
Yes.
Yeah.
But there are other options because, and again, the code is not prescriptive. It's very flexible and it's open to panels to interview as many people as they wish to. So, you know, if they think this candidate or this potential candidate has merit, we'd like to interview them. I'm perfectly happy with that as long as everyone else who meets the criteria to the same extent gets an interview too. It's just about fairness for people.
Yeah, okay. You used the phrase earlier, failure rate. What did you mean by failure rate?
If you run an appointment round and you fail to identify a suitable candidate for appointment.
Right, so not being able to find somebody.
Yes, yeah.
And that, I think, has been an issue. It's come through in the Auditor General's report. And I think in your various surveys. How big a problem is it? Since the new code, so we've tracked all the stats. Since the new code came in, the chair failure rate is 25%. 25% of 25%. Yep. Haven't found a chair. Yes. Presumably, eventually they have, but that's that seems quite high to me. Is that? I would agree. Yeah. Yeah. I think it's very, very concerning. I spoke earlier about supporting the government, and I am supportive of the government because it's in none of our interests for any public body to be without a chair when they need them, or at least a level of continuity. So other measures are put in place to ensure that that happens, with my agreement. But if you're looking for a new chair and you're not unable to identify one, that's not good news. They have implemented a new programme, relatively new, I think it's 3 years old now, which is the Aspiring NHS Chairs programme. I've provided one of my public appointments advisors who was previously the chair of an NHS trust to provide advice and guidance in respect of that activity
I speak to the cohort myself every year about leadership, culture, etc. So, that is something that the Scottish Government is doing, which I hope bears fruit.
Yeah. The convener, he used the phrase earlier that there's certainly an impression of a revolving door of people in Quangos, which he didn't fully accept. But if we just look at health board chairs, we've got, actually myself and the convener have got a very good example in the region that we represent. The former chair of Lanarkshire Health Board is now the chair of Forth Valley Health Board. Now, do you consider that an appropriate state of affairs, or?
So what I can tell you is,
one to the other.
What I can tell you is that the code of conduct was complied on that appointment round, in as much as of all the people who applied, the person who was appointed met the criteria for selection set by the Minister most closely. If I'm going to take a step back, which I presume the committee may find helpful, I don't think it's ideal because, and this is not a new message from me, I don't think sufficient people who are not currently in the system are being encouraged to apply. And I'm not sure necessarily that the system is set up to appoint people who are looking to deliver against, or who will be needed to deliver against, these ministerial priorities under the public sector reform agenda. I do think things need to be opened up to a much wider pool. And there are several factors that may have an impact on that. I've said I genuinely believe that there's not enough thought necessarily given to succession planning. And I'm not sure, so you've mentioned Forth Valley, has enough thought been given to the operational context of this body when the role description and person specification has been designed? I see an awful lot of coincidence across person specifications for the chairs of NHS bodies. That's perhaps understandable. They've got their blueprint for good governance, and it discusses the sorts of attributes that they're looking for. Fine. But my only observation, and it's perhaps a trite one, is that if you keep asking for the same things, then inevitably the process will deliver the same things for you.
The same people?
Yes.
So do you think then when they're advertising for a board chair, they should be, maybe changing the way they advertise the role?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, no, there is definitely more that can be done. Quite frequently we see NHS chair roles being advertised in tandem, so I'm not sure that they're necessarily paying enough attention to the area served by that board. People are very, very loyal to the NHS, and people within a territorial area clearly are going to, have a great deal of loyalty to that particular board. It's difficult for me to determine how many people in that area or how many people with a connection to that area would also have the skills that you would want to be chairing that NHS board, whether or not they would find it attractive, etc. But I think there are other ways in which people could be attracted potentially to fulfil these roles. And going back to one of the intentions behind the 2022 code, when I'd said I need officials to start reporting on reasons for success and failure. So yes, it's helpful to know why something's failed, because you can work out what to do better next time. But also, when they identify why they were successful, I'm not sure that the corporate memory within the government is sufficiently well developed to share that intelligence. Because sometimes you can see rounds are run really successfully. They do attract someone who's never fulfilled a role in the public sector in Scotland previously. They end up going on to do a great job. What did you do on that occasion, and what can we learn in order to achieve that for this particular appointment? I think there's scope for the Scottish Government to do better in that area.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. So is it your view then that you were talking about the local connection? I mean, if I was to apply to be the chair of a board, I live in Lanarkshire, why would I apply to be a chair of a board anywhere other than Lanarkshire? Because that's where I've lived for over 30 years. So you feel that local connection is is really important?
Not necessarily, because and I think, in fairness to the NHS, it used to be that was a qualifying criterion, which was you needed to live or work in that area. I think potentially that was problematic, because inevitably every new criterion you introduce, you're restricting your pool to an extent. And people may have connections to Lanarkshire that aren't live at the moment, but they may have had family there previously, or they may see that a board has a particular issue and feel that's a challenge that I would really like to step up for. You've got people in industry, for example, who've faced particular challenges, been successful, and think, well, what I've done there, I can transfer here and make a significant change. And I wouldn't necessarily want to rule people out simply because they're not based in that area.
Okay. Have you come across any evidence of people applying to be members of multiple boards?
Well, they can, but we do have obviously we can't prevent people applying for roles, but we do have a fit and proper person test in the code, and it's applied in quite an exacting fashion. And one of the things that people need to meet in order to apply successfully is the time commitment. If they can't, then they're simply ruled out. So it's not possible to fulfil a great many roles, because the panel will be aware of them. I require the Scottish ministers to publish, the identities of everyone who's appointed to every board, and that again sits in the code. So there are only so many roles you can fulfil, and people are quizzed quite closely on the time commitment, not just on boards, but there are other activities to provide assurance that they are able to dedicate sufficient time.
I'm going to ask you about time and remuneration, but have you got any? Have you come across any examples of people who serve on more than one board?
Yes. And again, it's all published and in the public domain. I require that to be the case.
Yeah. Okay. Would they be on two boards, or are there any that sit on more than two boards?
I think two is probably the maximum. We could certainly have a look for you, do some research, and come back to the committee if that's of interest. That would be
interesting.
Yes.
So if I can just sort of, in closing, just ask you about the issue of time and remuneration, because that's obviously people need to have the time to do it. Yes. That's a factor, but remuneration, you've raised that as an issue. Are you saying that board chairs, for example, are not paid enough, or not enough to attract the right people?
I tend to base my views on evidence, and I hope the committee does the same. And I undertook this survey in order to try and get an answer to that question. And the survey was of chairs and board members. We ran the survey, and we also ran a number of focus groups. I'll maybe ask Melanie to come in. We've got some details here. As I say, the report's currently sitting with the Scottish Government just to ensure that it's accurate. But
yeah, so we're limited as to what we can pass on about that. But what we asked was whether people felt whether the remuneration they received for the role was appropriate and proportionate to the level of responsibilities that they undertook, rather than is it enough as such. And so it was also closely tied in with the amount of time that they committed to the role. So when we run it, the survey in 2020, published in 21, there was 55% that said no, they didn't think that it was that the remuneration was appropriate or proportionate. And it was a slightly different question when we ran it this time, because in 2020 we had another category which was non-remunerated, and that was 7%. So it was just slightly different, but this time it was 64% that said no, they didn't think the remuneration was proportionate or appropriate.
So that's clearly gone up.
But if you took the 7% as a separate, because we didn't have that category in the question, because it was a slightly different question this time. So it's gone up by a couple of percentage points, I would say.
What is the level of remuneration for, say, a board chair or a member of a board?
So that's different depending on which board. And I was about to follow on and say in the focus groups, one of the key, say, concerns or thoughts that came through was it was as much about understanding remuneration as to the actual amount of remuneration, and people's lack of clarity around why different boards attracted different types of remuneration, because some are unpaid and others attract closer to sort of private sector type of remuneration. It's based on a Scottish Government's pay policy, but certainly the board members and chairs found it difficult to understand who was getting what and why.
Sorry, what's difficult to understand?
The different levels of remuneration for different boards and why they were different.
Okay. Can you give us some examples of figures?
Jess, I think it's in the region of 30,000 for a chair, in the region of 10 for a member. We can certainly come back to you with precise figures, but there is significant variance. For the boards that are non-remunerated, it's because they've got charitable status, so the likes of the national museums, national galleries. So, you know, you basically got a chair and non-executives there who get no remuneration at all.
Focusing on the NHS.
Yes,
today.
I understand. Yeah,
so,
yeah, but
the
survey was all boards.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in terms of NHS boards, though, around about 30,000 for
that's my understanding.
A board chair.
Yeah.
And how much? What's the time? How much time is expected?
So that's published in the packs. I think it's roughly 2 days a week, but I think it's in excess of that. Again, we can come back to the committee with the latest and most precise figures, and I'm more than happy to do that after today.
Right. I think that's useful for us to know, because if there's an issue, if people are thinking that round about 30,000 for 2 days a week isn't of interest, I think that it's good to know that. So I'll end it there, Chair.
I think it's what you were saying. So again, one of the things the code requires is it needs to state what the time commitment and what the remuneration rate is at the point at which those roles are advertised. What the survey has highlighted is that people feel that they're actually doing more than was advertised, which is why it's problematic from my perspective.
Okay, so they're told it's 2 days a week. It ends up being more.
It ends up being more.
But
yes.
The pay doesn't go up.
Do we have some figures on that?
Just on
Time commitment.
the time commitment of the people, the percentage of our respondees, which again is all board chairs and members, not just NHS, but who felt they were doing more than what had been advertised in the pack. In 2020 was 62%, and this time 64%. So
right.
So
okay,
significant.
Okay, thank you. Before we move on, can I just pick up on another issue which Graham Simpson raised, which is about the connections with the local communities. I mean, for a considerable period of time, as I understand it, in the NHS Western Isles, the only person that lived on the Western Isles that was on the NHS Western Isles board was the chair. And in fact, some of the non-executive members of that board haven't even visited the Western Isles. I mean, and there was then a public outcry about it. But, I mean, how do you ensure that kind of situation doesn't arise?
Well, it's open to the Minister, to be honest with you. I've said already, if they wish to include a geographical criterion, it's open to them to do that. When I introduced the new code, it used to, talk about the attributes you were looking for in terms of skills, knowledge and experience only. When I introduced the revised code, I'd said, look, you can define things much more widely than this. You can look for things like lived experience, of, accessing healthcare from a particular perspective. Or you can say you need to be based in this region in order to serve on this board. So that's entirely at the gift of ministers. Where they have a balancing act is to determine, am I going to get the best possible person to fulfil this role based here, based on the time commitment, based on the remuneration, etc., based on the board's current circumstances by restricting it geographically, or will it be better in terms of the outcome to open it out? And it's not for me to determine for ministers what they want for a particular board, but it's certainly not something that I would preclude.
Isn't it also about diversity and having some kind of blend?
Yes.
I mean, a situation like the one I've just described doesn't seem to me to be in any way acceptable at all.
Well, you're entirely right, and that's why I've said it's so important when they are planning for succession that they have a look at the current board's composition. What's the composition of the boards? What are its circumstances? What are the challenges it's facing? What does its strategy say? Who's best able to, to come in and complement the existing membership in order for us to be as successful as we possibly can be? So you're quite right. Homogenous boards are, and there's a growing evidence base for this, less effective than heterogeneous ones.
OK, I'm going to now invite Colin Beattie to put some questions to you. Colin.
Thank you, Mayor. I'd like to circle back on diversity. The Auditor General's report, paragraph 60, talks about issues of diversity remaining in some boards and highlights, for example, in terms of protected characteristics and in bringing the perspectives of people who actually use the services. Yes. How can that be improved? There's a great difficulty in getting non-executive directors at the best of times. And, I've had the experience of jobs being re-advertised and so on, trying to increase that pool. Diversity and getting representation of diversity is quite complex because diversity is very diverse. How do you reach out into the different groupings that you would like to see represented on the boards? How do you do that?
Sure. So I'm going to give you a nuanced response. I hope you'll forgive me. I think it's very, very important that we not necessarily think of diversity simply in terms of protected characteristics. So the fact that a board is balanced, shall we say, in terms of protected characteristics, isn't necessarily an indicator that it's diverse. So you could have 50% women, 50% men, but all from very similar backgrounds with very similar outlooks. So from my perspective, it's much wider than that, and it needs to be. And as I say, we've just produced a State of the Nation report, and I think it discusses it in a very helpful way. Cognitive diversity is very important to board effectiveness when you're looking at things like risk, when you're looking at things like strategy, when you're looking at things like community engagement. People from different backgrounds help, and people who are willing to challenge each other and the non-executives help boards to reach better decisions. So simply being visibly diverse in and of itself is not sufficient. That's not to say that it's not important, because people need to see themselves, communities need to see themselves reflected on boards as well. So, it's important to that extent. Again, just going back to the 2022 code, one of the things that I said was quite important and that I didn't see much evidence of, and I still don't, is that boards and ministers can take positive action measures in order to encourage people from different backgrounds to apply, and perhaps with different protected characteristics to apply. And I've suggested that boards should go further. I would love to see every board with a succession planning committee of its own, to be honest with you, and mirror what goes on in terms of good practice in the private sector. But are they reaching out to their communities? Are they running mentoring schemes for people who perhaps aren't board ready at the moment but could be in the future? Are they running apprenticeship schemes? They could be doing all of these things alongside their current board work. And in terms of the community outreach work that they're doing, are they helping people to understand actually board membership could be an option for you? Because I think at the moment, most members of the public view all this as quite arcane and separate from them and not necessarily something for them, when in fact they could make a great contribution.
Given the different pools of talent that you'd want to tap into, we have difficulty, this committee's had difficulty over a number of years now with the quality of governance of boards. People with the skills and the willingness to do the job, frankly, are few and far between. How do we ensure that that quality is maintained while still getting people from these diverse pools to step forward into the job. How do you maintain that quality?
Yeah.
Well, I'll say maintain the quality. How do you get the quality up?
Absolutely. So, again, I'm saying something that I've said previously, so I hope you'll forgive me, but achieving diversity on boards, it's a misconception. It isn't achieved by lowering the bar. You know, merit is absolutely overriding, you know, an overriding principle in that code of practice. People can only and should only be appointed if they meet the criteria for selection that have been set by appointing minister. And I understand what you're saying about failures in governance. As I've said, I review the work of this committee regularly, and it forms part of our briefing for the people who are going in to provide oversight of the next appointment round for a public body. Whether or not it's the quality of appointments that led to those failures is debatable, and I think it would potentially be helpful to do some research in that area. For our own part, we do reach out to senior civil servants and public body chairs a year after the appointments are made, and we ask them, so you plan for succession, you wanted to bring on board people who could do X, Y and Z, make this contribution, they're there for a year now, what difference are they making? So that again is some research that we're doing and again sharing with the Scottish Government, and it's all with a view to continuous improvement.
The General's made comment about the particular issues in rural areas. How do you see that being tackled?
It is a challenge. My influence at the moment is on an appointment round by appointment round basis, and I think that's an issue for us, which is why I'm looking to refresh the diversity strategy, because I think we now need to lift our heads and not think about, because quite a lot of the discussions are around the appointments process and whether or not, you know, the process is delivering X, Y and Z. I think we collectively need to lift our heads. We face significant challenges in Scotland, and we're not going to address them using the current system. And there are national and regional issues that need to be addressed, and they aren't going to be addressed on a round-by-round basis. So again, I would welcome the committee's views on things that the system could do differently in order to address regional issues such as the lack of people who are willing or able to put themselves forward or considered suitable for appointment in, for example, rural areas.
Are there any boards that are particularly good at this, good at the engagement?
Yes, some are, although I would hesitate to put anyone in the spotlight at this point in time. But again, I'd be happy to go and have a look and see whether or not there are examples, because when we get those reports from both our public appointments advisors at the end of appointment rounds and from the chairs, there are quite a few who say actually the level of engagement with the community was one of the factors in success in this particular appointment round. So, and going back to an earlier point, I would like to see more of that rolled out, which is what precisely did they do in this, for example, territorial NHS board area that genuinely engaged the community and delivered something different for the board on this occasion.
What have they actually done that's different, that's enabled them to get a better result?
Yes, any number of things have been tried in the past, and again, I would just, part of my frustration is that they aren't recognised necessarily and rolled out. Going back a wee while, I remember for NHS Grampian, they had just a really, really compelling publicity campaign. You went into the train station and these board roles were being advertised, in public places and NHS waiting rooms, but places where people congregated, and the level of engagement was different. And the materials that were used were much more accessible. So those would be examples of measures that were used and which we saw made a significant difference to the number and diversity of people who put themselves forward.
A bit random, picking a public place and banging up a few posters and so on. You'd think there'd be a bit more scientific in this.
That's a very, very good point, and that's why we're asking for people to reflect on what worked well and what didn't at the end of this process. Because, if you don't try new things, you're not you're not going to have the evidence base to know whether or not that was good, we'll do it again, or that wasn't good and we'll not.
Okay, I'll move on a little bit. The Auditor General's report highlights the turnover of senior staff, and 12 new chief executives, including 10 new chief executives to territorial boards. That's 23, 24, 24, 25. IJBs also talk about more than 50% of their senior leadership turning over. That's a huge challenge, and I just wonder what sort of process is in place to help manage the stability, and is it successful? You need that synergy between the senior management to be able to run a successful organisation, and recruiting so many new people in is obviously going to create, at least temporarily, a slight hiatus in the process. How can the appointment process ensure that the chairs and non-executives are able to provide that stability during the period of leadership change?
I think that's a very good question, and clearly it's problematic that there is such a high level of turnover. I mentioned earlier, one of my recommendations, and I stand by it, is that boards should have succession planning committees. And so clearly my area of focus is chairs and non-executives. I've got no oversight whatsoever of staff appointments. But if they had those succession planning committees, then they could be considering both chair and non-exec roles, but also executive roles. And I could see a committee having a role in doing that. And that's about ensuring that you've got a pipeline. Ensuring that you've got processes in place such that when senior leaders depart, then others are able to step up, appropriate schemes of delegation, etc., upskilling existing staff so that that sort of coverage can be made available. For my own part, in terms of NHS chair and non-exec appointments, if the operational context for a board is that it's had a significant turnover in its leadership team, then I would expect them to be looking for someone to come in who's perhaps got experience of successfully managing a situation like that previously, in order to bring that expertise to the board to assist them during that period.
A lot of people with these skills to come in and cover for all these changes.
Well, as the convener pointed out, boards shouldn't be homogenous, and when you're looking for someone new for a board, they don't need to have all of the skills that the board overall needs. You perhaps need someone with a particular focus or a particular background to assist a board with a particular project or a particular issue for a set period of time. Appointment periods are usually sort of 3 to 4 years. People potentially can be reappointed. So if you've got a short-term issue, I see nothing wrong with looking for a specialist to assist in terms of the oversight for that period.
It seems to me that sort of high level of turnover among the senior executives, it's got to create some issues of stability and continuity. And it seems that there doesn't seem to be very much in place to manage that.
Not really my bailiwick. I'm sorry to be ducking that, but it isn't really. Certainly in terms of chairs and non-executives, the Scottish ministers can come to me at any time to make a case for a code, what's called a code variation. So if a board's having particular issues in terms of continuity in respect of chair or NHS members, they can make relatively short-term emergency appointments to ensure that that continuity is in place. And although the code sets an 8-year limit on people serving on boards, that can be extended with my agreement in order to provide the continuity that boards need. I've said previously I'm all about ensuring the right outcome for boards, but once people are appointed, I'm clearly all about, well, certainly from my perspective, and I trust from the committees as well, boards being able to do the best they possibly can given the circumstances that they face, and that sometimes means just varying the rules to allow for that continuity to be assured.
Now, you mentioned reappointments and extensions. The Code of Practice indicates that, or requires, that there's a proper appraisal of their performance and evidence that they do continue to meet the board's needs. Are you satisfied that that process is robust enough?
I think there's some variation, but that's simply based on anecdotal evidence. We don't get too many complaints, and certainly none that I can recall in respect of reappointment. No, actually, I did have one, but certainly not in the NHS, and it's in the public domain. So it's very, very rare that we have complaints about reappointments. All I can say is it's not guaranteed, but I think there's some variation in terms of appraisal.
But the process that the Code of Conduct requires, do you think it's robust enough for the job?
I feel it is. I feel that perhaps appraisal could be more robust than it currently is, and perhaps more consideration could be given to whether or not people genuinely meet the needs of the board going forward. Reappointment tends to be the norm rather than the exception.
Is it adequate analysis in the appraisals? You've presumably seen quite a few of them go past your desk. Is there enough analysis about the board's future needs and the ability of that person being considered for extension or whatever, being able to contribute to that?
So that is a good question, and the reality is I currently don't provide direct oversight of those appraisals. But it's certainly something I will take away. I mean, you know, you've made me think there. That's something I'll take away and think about running a thematic review on. I was asked earlier about, you know, do you provide oversight of every shortlisting process? No, you know, as with every other public sector organisation, my resource is limited, and I'll want to dedicate it to what delivers best in terms of public assurance. So I will certainly give some thought to whether or not the fact that reappointments tend to be the norm is appropriate, and whether or not more thought should be given to that in future. So we'll add that to our list as a potential thematic review.
Just to remind me, the appraisal process, is there actually a template for that?
Genuinely, it varies across all the boards.
So if you like, it's freehand?
I would guess. And it is a guess, so this is conjecture on my part. I'm sure the Chief Executive of the NHS will be able to give you the precise detail on this, based on the way in which the NHS work, and I think they work quite differently to the other Director General areas in which I operate. I would guess that they probably have quite a sophisticated process in place, and that it would probably be relatively standardised, and that's simply because of the work that they've done, for example, on the blueprint for good governance, etc. They tend to be kind of ahead of the game in comparison with other Director General areas when it comes to the level of formality, etc. So I would think they probably have something quite robust in place.
Thank you, Vera.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm now going to invite the Deputy Convener, Jamie Green, to put some questions to you. Jamie.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. So, my first question off the back of the last series of questions is around the diversity of boards and public appointments. Mr. Bruce, you'll obviously be aware outside of this room that there's a much wider discussion and narrative around the use of diversity, equality and inclusion in the appointment of public appointments, including boards and chairs. There's a great school of thought in either direction as to the importance or necessity of it. Now, I'm not particularly asking for your view on the politics of all of that, but as someone who has oversight of appointments to quite senior positions across 100-odd agencies, what is your view on that?
On whether or not diversity on boards is important? I think it's vitally important, but and just perhaps to build on the answer I gave earlier, we shouldn't view diversity in a way in which, through the lens of protected characteristics. That's very, very important. Diversity is about different backgrounds, perspectives, viewpoints, types of experience. I'm going to lapse into a bit of a story here, but in 2008, the last diversity strategy was launched. And shortly thereafter, there was an international financial crisis, and we're still feeling the effects of that today. I've been studying board governance for a long time, 20 years. And the report that came out on the back of that disaster, there was one of the annexes was produced by the Tavistock Institute, so that long ago. And it spoke about the difficulties that arose from a board of non-executive directors or boards of non-executive directors on significant financial institutions who basically had lapsed into groupthink. And when you lapse into groupthink, you don't identify risks properly, and so on and so forth. The paper's by Manny Sher. I would recommend it. So I feel I have a genuine and deep understanding of the value of diversity, and I am hoping to engage everyone, this committee, members of the public, boards themselves, Scottish ministers, in a conversation about what that should look like going forward. And it's not about tokenism. It's about ensuring that boards are properly equipped with all those different viewpoints in order to fulfil the role that they are appointed to fulfil.
That's interesting. I guess there is a very valid debate around how far one should go to ensure diversity. There's, again, a spectrum of views on that. But, I mean, having, like I'm sure other members around the table, we've sat on recruitment panels for public appointments. And I have to say, I've done a couple over the years, and there's been very little diversity in the candidates that make it through the sifting process, and indeed good candidates that I felt would have added diversity, not just due to their protected characteristics, but just what they would bring to the table, but have simply not made it through due to the quite rigorous and indeed specified points-based systems that we often use in these panels. That I believe has ruled people out of the process very early on, unfortunately, and I personally haven't found that as being a good thing.
So I would agree. I don't believe in scoring. Scoring can only ever be a proxy for what's in front of you, and there is a level of subjectivity when it comes to assessing people. But again, saying what I said earlier, clearly, I am the guardian of fairness in this process, for want of a better expression. And once the criteria for selection have been set, it's simply not fair to others to bring someone through because, they appear to have some attributes that are attractive. So it's vitally important that an awful lot of thought is given at the start to what this board actually needs and what it doesn't need. Because I sometimes see person specifications, and things have improved over the years, don't get me wrong, diversity in terms of protected characteristics, which can only ever be an indicator. As I said, you can have a sex-balanced board, but not necessarily lots of diverse views. So, yeah, protected characteristics only ever can be an indicator. But I've seen lots of improvements over the years and lots of different types of people being appointed since I started in this field. Even though the change has been incremental, there has been a change. But the code is very flexible. More thought can be given to person specifications. And again, I think looking back at what worked and what didn't is always really important. I love to see wash-ups. If you've been a panel member and you have that opportunity again in future, why not ask for one? And our people certainly encourage them and sit down and go, well, we wish we could have appointed this person because they would have brought X, Y, and Z. What was it about this person's specification that ruled them out?
I can tell you it was the points.
Well,
And that's, you know, these are live conversations which I'm sure happen with sponsorship divisions as well when they're recruiting people. If someone just doesn't get over 70 points and someone got 69 and they're shortlisted for the next stage. And I find that a very odd way of doing business.
I've recently issued, I constantly issue guidance to officials. There's been significant turnaround as well in the public appointments team, which is basically the sort of centre of expertise. But I've recently issued guidance and just said, the code doesn't require you to score people. It's just a proxy. And again, you know, you don't need to shortlist. You can invite as many people to interview as you want. And these things aren't necessarily well understood. But I'm always available for a chat. So if any panel has concerns that, you know, we aren't going to get the best outcome on this occasion, they pick up the phone to me and I'll happily have a chat with them.
That's very helpful. I think actually the Scottish Parliament might be first on my list of people to come and invite you to talk to. We've obviously had a lot of board members in front of us over the years, and we have seen some of the most, I would say, egregious failures of boards, just by the nature of what we do, and particularly off the back of reports from the Auditor General. And they tend to fall into one of two categories. One is where there's a blurring of relationships between boards, chairs of boards, and executive management teams of the agencies that work there full time, and indeed the sponsors within the Scottish Government and the civil servants on one side. On the other side is a complete breakdown of those relationships. Can I ask what work you do to proactively look at those relationships, and what have you identified in any work that you have done?
Sure. I'll need to be relatively reticent about what I say here because, as the committee will be aware, the other part of my role is to investigate complaints about chairs and board members of public bodies. Now, I mentioned the fit and proper person test earlier. In comparison with councillors, complaints about board members are relatively rare. In our last financial year, I think it was 137 for councillor cases, 15 for board members. But the fit and proper person test does need panels to ensure that the individuals haven't done anything incompatible with the body they're going to be appointed to previously, but also that they're required to commit to the principles of public life in Scotland and adhere to the code. Notwithstanding that, sometimes I get complaints, and sometimes I can see that, you know, conduct has been inappropriate, and it tends to be that, you know, the culture of a body is not working in the way that it should. Hopefully, picking up on your point there about when relationships break down. So again, I need to be reticent, but anything that's in the public domain already, because I'm not allowed to discuss live investigations, anything that's in the public domain already, I do share with the public appointments advisors and say, look, you know, there are these issues, there are these tensions, and I think it's important that these are discussed when you're talking about who you're bringing on board. And I think there should be a measure of honesty as well for prospective candidates about potentially what they're walking into. In terms of cosiness, I don't get to see that evidence. Because it's just not part of my role. Once people are appointed, I've got very few opportunities to actually look at things unless they're going bad. And I suppose to an extent, my work resembles the work of the committee in that way. I only get to see things when they're going very badly wrong, which isn't great. And
I mean, is that a problem for you? I mean, it seems like a very reactive role rather than a proactive one. I mean, if you know, we've already identified some patterns of issues in the NHS, for example, around turnover, around inability to the failure rate, for example, and the issues that certain boards are having in recruiting board members and so on. So you have a wider, over a longer period of time, a nice wide view of that. Would you like the power to have a more proactive role in digging into investigations in the same way that Audit Scotland, if they so choose, can do a report on
Sure.
a particular body? Would you like to be able to do the same?
How does one put this?
Or would it be helpful if the Commissioner's role was able to do that?
I think I currently step into spaces that maybe aren't necessarily anticipated. So I'm currently doing research on incivility in public life. I think that's a good example because I firmly believe that it's harmful to democracy and that in turn is clearly harmful to governance, and that applies to clearly local authorities, but this place, and to boards as well. I'm here to provide assurance, but people aren't going to be encouraged to apply unless they're going to be treated fairly, and unless they feel that when they arrive on a given board that they're going to be treated with respect and appropriately, etc. So I am actually conducting research in that area. Whether or not I should be looking at whether the culture is, how does one put this, too cosy, not sufficiently challenging once people are in post. I was recently in front of another committee that was looking at overlaps, and that's something I think that we all want to avoid. And from my perspective, I think the Auditor General is doing very good work in that area. Perhaps you could ask him whether or not he'd like to have powers to look at things before they fall apart, but I think he may feel that he's probably got sufficient power in that area already, but I wouldn't want to be fulfilling a role that's rightly for him.
Oh, but I mean, the Parliament has the power to legislate in this area.
Indeed.
If we wanted to give the Commissioner more power, we could, if there was an appetite to do so.
Indeed.
Or a need to do so.
Indeed.
And, is there a gap in the market for
Yes.
somebody looking at these 100 public bodies?
Yes.
And reducing the level of complaints that come in other words, improving best practice before it gets to that stage where things are going.
Yes, I'm absolutely doing that already. I genuinely am. So perhaps elaborate. I am not just doing research on incivility in public life. I'm currently working with the Standards Commission for Scotland, the Improvement Service and Audit Scotland. And that's horizon scanning work. And we just started that in the last year. I'm also part of the COSLA Round Table on improving civility in public life, and there are a great many partners involved in that, the Joe Cox Foundation, Standards Commission again, Police Scotland. So I am not simply reactive, I am being very proactive in that area, because I agree with you. And going back to what I said about my approach to my role at the start, it's about prevention. It genuinely is. I don't want to be here in front of the committee saying, well, that went wrong, but I hadn't overseen it, or I hadn't foreseen that it might happen. That's not how I see my role.
Please don't take this next question as a difficult one, because I don't want you to breach any confidence in terms of
Sure.
the work that you do. But over the last year, how many complaints against board members of those 800 odd, or nearly 800 people in that space, have you dealt with, and how many live cases are you working on, and are you seeing any common patterns or themes emerging from the nature of those complaints, again without mentioning the specifics of them?
Last financial year it was around 15. I couldn't give you the live figure at the moment, because that's constantly changing. We get complaints in all the time, and some turn into cases, that's admissible and others don't. I'm aware of at least 2 at the moment that I would classify as significant and unanticipated, to be honest with you, in respect of a board. But I can say no more than that about those particular cases.
Report on those? Are they a matter of public record?
Absolutely. So, no, they are. All my reports go to the Standards Commission for Scotland. And the Standards Commission for Scotland has 3 options. They can direct for further investigation, they can hold a hearing, or they can do neither. So, trying to think, the last public body hearing that they held was in respect of the Crofting Commission. And that was where a board member was deemed to have acted inappropriately. And I was aware of that complaint going on at the same time that I was aware that there were some governance issues at the Crofting Commission. So I understand, in a very privileged position. It just so happens the way the legislation's written, I need to be very, very reticent about what I can and can't report while these things are going on. In terms of your last question, incivility in public life, it's on the rise, and that's the thing that most complaints that come to my office are about. Rates on that are currently sitting at about 60%. It's a worry.
Is that just people behaving inappropriately in the public sphere, essentially, in terms of their language or treatment of other staff?
It's a mix.
Right.
So, yes, there's some in the public sphere, and there's no question that social media is driving some of it up. but some of it's in person. Yeah.
That's quite worrying. My last question is obviously with this session, and indeed the next one is particularly around NHS boards. Do you have any current emerging concerns about behaviour in boards or the quality of board members? Or I mean, we're trying to get as much out of you as we can about the state of the NHS in Scotland.
Yes. No, I think it would be the fair answer. And again, as with me, you see things when things go wrong. There are a lot of NHS boards out there. They're doing magnificent work. I mean, they genuinely are. And I don't get the impression, certainly from the sorts of complaints that I receive, that there is an issue, either with individual boards or more widely. I could be wrong, but I can only base what I tell you on the evidence that's before me. We do work closely with the Scottish Government, perhaps most closely with the NHS, because that's where most of the appointments lie. And I think collectively we're keen to deliver the very best that we can for the people of Scotland. But nothing shouts out to me at the moment. I mean, we all know what happened in NHS Highland. I mean, there was basically a collapse in culture. I'm not aware of anything like that the committee ought to be aware of. Certainly not from my perspective.
Okay, I guess at what point though, if you have an NHS board which is, for example, financially in the red, so there are clearly financial governance issues. If it has performance or operational related issues, like it's not meeting any of its clinical targets, and it has high turnover and other issues of governance, at what point do you have to wait on someone to complain to you before there's an investigation into that board? I mean, to me that doesn't, there are clearly situations where there is a direct level of accountability to the board to oversee all of the above. Yes.
Yeah. And
there are clearly failures in many of those. We look at them on a weekly basis.
Yeah, no, I understand that, but probably quite important for me to, again, I'm not trying to shrink my role, but it's not for me to look at board governance. But complaints come to me when governance failures turn into something else. So, I mean, just to use a simple example, and I do see this, if there isn't sufficient money, then members with different interests may start to become discourteous, disrespectful to each other, because in effect they're fighting their own corner, and it's that sort of thing. And tensions at the top trickle down as well. I mean, why do we have whistleblowing champions in every NHS board? Those were introduced for a reason. So issues at the top and inappropriate culture at the top clearly trickles down, and it's when that happens that people then come and complain to me. And it can be at a relatively junior staff member level, or it can also be at executive level, and that happens as well. But in terms of governance more generally, that's not really that's not my sphere of influence, apart from when it comes to succession planning and ensuring boards have what they need to face the circumstances that they face.
Okay, thank you, Convener. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm now going to turn to Keith Brown, who's got a final round of questions to put to you. Keith.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning. I'm just conscious of what you were saying earlier on about the development of scrutiny of public appointments. So I do recall back in 2007 when I came to the Parliament, I think public appointments were a separate committee of the Parliament, and I think I became the first convener of the Conjoined Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee. I'm conscious since then, and I suppose I've spent a decade of that intervening time making ministerial appointments, that there's been a huge, in my view, expansion of the role of public appointments, as there has been in relation to audit. And I just wonder to what extent, I think it's a bit of a chimera that this is all really down to ministers. Actually, the freedom of choice to ministers is fundamentally limited, not least because of the code of conduct, the various things which you ask them to do and ensure are done, but also because of the nature of civil servants who, perhaps naturally enough, will tend to focus on people of like mind, and they're the ones that will draw up the shortlist by and large. Although they will ask ministers for any suggestions, I concede that point. So, but given all the rules around this now, to what extent do you think that maybe the environment they're being asked to operate in to make these appointments is now counterproductive. And as far as it is so hedged around, that the freedom to, exercise a bit of diversity to appoint a candidate, a bit like Jamie Green was saying in relation to the Parliament, that might not fit the model, is much more constrained now, especially in an environment where you've got 25% failure to appoint, at least at the first round. Do you think in the same way that in the report here we're looking at saying diversity must include the ability to look from outside and be objective about it and think afresh, to what extent would you say you've done that within your office and looking afresh at the impact of what you do on the appointments process?
Absolutely. So there have been several iterations of the Code of Practice, and the 2022 version is absolutely the most flexible that it's ever been. If there is an issue in terms of what ministers are getting, I think that's highly problematic. And I'd be more than happy to engage with any Scottish minister to have a proper discussion about why the process isn't delivering for them. And I absolutely understand what you say in terms of civil service involvement, etc. But I think there are views about rules, about the way in which things need to be done, emanating from that code, which frankly are inaccurate. They're inaccurate. This new code was designed entirely to deliver the right outcomes. And when I talk about outcomes, it's what the minister wants. And if it's not delivered, then they're your civil servants. They're answerable to you for why it failed to deliver what you wanted. And I'm saying this quite publicly. I will speak to any Scottish minister if they have concerns about this system, or to the Scottish ministers collectively. Because if it's not working for them, it's not working. But it's certainly, that cannot be laid at the feet of my office. And I'm happy to enter into constructive dialogue to that effect.
I suppose, well, on the one hand, I think civil servants are absolutely assiduous at making sure they comply with the code, which may be an issue in itself, is the point I was making. It wasn't really to say feedback from ministers might inform, some further thinking as to whether to say, how have you sought to ensure that you have looked as much as you can from outside and thought maybe the environment here is not produced, not what ministers want, but just, if you're talking about 25% failure and other challenges which are in there, that we're not getting this right. And I have to say, I should say that I think the view of ministers, certainly when I was there, was that your office is very cooperative and pragmatic in applying these rules. But is the environment now so hedged around that the freedom to get the less conventional candidates even onto a shortlist is now being nullified?
As I said earlier, you can interview as many people as you want. So, and if you want an unconventional candidate, ask for one. I mean, I'm sorry to be simplistic about it, but if you're the minister and you want something different, just let them know this is what I want this time, and then it's up to them to deliver. That's the way it's meant to work.
I think it's the example you gave before about singling out a candidate who might be non-meritorious. I don't think anybody wants to get into that situation. It's not good for the candidate either. So it's more the felt pressure which pushes towards. Anyway, a separate point really on the NHS appointment specifically. And you might not want to answer this question. I would understand why if you don't. That is it simply a function of the proliferation of boards, NHS boards that we have in Scotland, that's part of the reason why we are struggling to fill all of them with the right calibre of candidates all the time?
I don't have the evidence to give a proper answer, so anything I say in that area would be purely conjecture. What I can say is, I've already mentioned the diversity strategy. I think we all need to lift our heads up and look more widely. Public sector reform, regardless of your political persuasion, I think we are all on the same page. It needs to happen. You're talking about the number of boards. there's clearly a number of positions attached to that. You know, we're only talking, well, it's fewer than 800 people across Scotland. There are an awful lot of talented people in Scotland, so debatable whether or not the people are there, you know, their willingness to apply, etc., is something different perhaps. But there are work streams within public sector reform, and one of them certainly is looking at overlap and whether or not there's scope for rationalisation. So, and if that again is the will of the government of the day, then I've already said I will work cooperatively with that government in order to ensure that there's still continuity and that, you know, the ball keeps rolling and that governance continues to be provided while, you know, the necessary changes are made.
I mean, that, if you're agreed on the fact that there's more than enough talent in Scotland to fulfil all these roles, something's happening in between that talent and the ability to appoint to each of these positions as and when required because of the failure rate. So there's something in the system that would suggest that is not allowing us to tap into that talent that's there. But just on the point you made about we need to step back and look more widely, have you drawn any comparisons with what happens in Wales or Northern Ireland or England in relation to these issues?
So the administrations have diverged really significantly, and so has regulation of them since this office was established by the Act in 2003. I do have links with those different offices. I was asked to speak at the boardroom apprenticeship programme for England and Wales because, you know, there were some Scottish participants in the south, and that's just this last year. I can only go on anecdotal evidence in respect of England, but the impression I get there is that the public don't necessarily trust the system because there is so little assurance. So perhaps it's moved too far in a particular direction. So ministers may have more flexibility in that system, but whether or not that's delivering the ideal candidates for them and for boards, I think there are some questions there. Wales, currently governed by the Commissioner for England and Wales, the Senate sent a committee to come and speak to me about the model that we have in Scotland. They were persuaded that that would be the right model for Wales because from their perspective it is delivering. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that how things work here is perfect. Every system is always capable of improvement, but certainly from the Welsh Parliament's, and it wasn't just, you know, a committee recommendation, the Parliament is now pursuing this as a course of action. They liked what they saw in Scotland, and it's something that they'd like to take up themselves.
Yeah, I just think that having that comparator, you know, from neighbouring countries would be a really useful, and I mean more than what you'd be able to say about the links that you have with elsewhere, you know, in terms of performance, in terms of issues which are faced, not just in this area, it just seems to be, that's an obvious piece of work that would be useful. And also to say that I would agree that we're often the last to see the merits in the things that we do here in Scotland, so we tend to concentrate on the problems. But my last question is on what you've been saying about incivility. And I think this is a huge issue. We had a situation last week in Parliament where the refusal to accept an amendment to a bill on justice has resulted in a number of members of the Parliament being accused in social media of favouring child rape. I mean, that's how bad it's getting here now. And I think it's a huge issue. Many of us will have cameras and police patrols around their houses these days for death threats and so on. So incivility, I agree with you, it's a very present problem, and I was interested in the work you're doing with others. But what's really important, I think, in relation to that is that you speak up publicly about it, and not to say whatever I want you to say, but to say what you found. Because I must have, I do have a view that perhaps some of the issue, and I think you've alluded to this yourself, of people not coming forward, is they've seen the way that people can be treated in public roles. And unless people speak out about it, and not just those that are affected by it directly, that'd be members of boards, members of parliaments, members of council and so on, unless trusted actors like yourself also speak up about it, then it's going to be very hard to turn that tide backwards, I think.
I agree, absolutely. And I have been, and I intend to do more of that. Absolutely, I do. Our next quarterly team meeting with all the staff is for us to discuss collectively how we might use more channels to try and get some of these messages across to people. So I absolutely agree. And sorry to be changing tack slightly, but you'd asked about comparators for the system here. If you have a look at the State of the Nation report, there's actually research done on all sorts of comparators in the UK, but also international ones. So you can see how we fare against others there.
Thanks very much.
Not at all.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. I am conscious that we've run slightly over time, but I think for us it's been a really useful session. So can I take this opportunity to once again thank you, Ian Bruce and Melanie Stronach, for the evidence that you've given us this morning. It's been a very useful illumination of some of the points that were drawn out in the Auditor General's Spotlight report. And I think there were a number of areas where you promised to follow up. And as you said, Mr Bruce, it's also a point of reflection for you, giving evidence to a parliamentary committee. So there may be some things that you will share with us in a material fashion, other things you might share with us in a more spiritual fashion in the future. But can I thank both of you for your evidence, and I will now suspend the meeting to allow for a changeover of witnesses. Thank you. Thank you. Well, can I welcome everybody back to this morning's meeting of the Public Audit Committee. Agenda item 2 is NHS in Scotland Spotlight on Governance, the Auditor General's report. And in this part of the committee's deliberations, I'm very pleased to welcome 3 witnesses from the Scottish Government. We're joined in the committee room by Caroline Lamb, who's the Director General for Health and Social Care and the Chief Executive of NHS Scotland. Joining us remotely this morning is Fiona Bennett, who is the Director of Public Health Finance within the Scottish Government. We're also joined in the room by Christine McLaughlin, who is the Chief Operating Officer and Deputy Chief Executive of NHS Scotland. Before we go on, Fiona, can I just check, did I get your job title correct?
Hi, yes, I'm the Chief Finance Officer for Health and Social Care within Scottish Government. That's fine.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, we've got some questions to put to you, which will direct via you, Director General, and you can decide to bring in Christine and Fiona as appropriate. But before we get to our questions, I'm going to invite you to make a short opening statement.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thank you to the committee for the opportunity to speak today in response to Audit Scotland's Spotlight on Governance report. Strong governance is central to delivering a sustainable, high-performing health service that meets the needs of the people in Scotland. And I welcome the continued scrutiny and constructive challenge that Audit Scotland provides. I particularly welcome that the scope of this report considered not just how effectively the governance arrangements in NHS are supporting scrutiny, but also how they support reform across the health and care system. As you know, we published our Population Health Framework and our Service Renewal Framework just a month after the publication of this report, and so its key messages and recommendations have been particularly timely. The Service Renewal Framework sets out a bold, long-term strategy to transform how care is planned, delivered and experienced across 3 horizons: managing immediate pressures, innovating for the future and creating the conditions for fully transformed services. And its 5 core principles, prevention, people, community, population and digital, are fully aligned with our governance reform agenda. The Service Renewal Framework has been welcomed by stakeholders and local delivery systems and will provide greater certainty and enable more effective collaboration. The NHS Scotland Executive Group, established last year, is already helping to drive system-wide leadership and shared decision-making. However, we do recognise that there is much more to do, and as we stand up our structures for delivering the Service Renewal Framework, we're considering how our non-executive directors can provide additional scrutiny in addition to the mechanisms already in place through forums like the Health and Social Care Assurance Board. We also recognise that the governance and planning landscape is complex. However, the statutory framework under the NHS Scotland Act 1978 provides a clear legal foundation of accountability. NHS boards constituted by ministers are distinct legal entities responsible for service delivery within the parameters of government policy. We have already made progress. In June, we published a refreshed model framework document for territorial boards, which strengthens the sponsor relationship and clarifies roles and responsibilities between Scottish Government and all 22 NHS boards, bringing greater consistency across the system. And while the Blueprint for Good Governance remains a high-level guidance document, we recognise the need for stronger operational support and external validation of self-assessments. So we're actively exploring options to promote consistency and shared learning across boards, and our future support will place greater emphasis on innovation, reform and collaborative governance. As part of the Service Renewal Framework, we've also committed to an NHS accountability review to help to clarify national priorities, strengthen performance oversight and empower leaders to act with confidence. It's about creating the right environment, one that encourages innovation, responsible risk-taking, better data sharing and cross-organisational working. Audit Scotland also notes the risks that may arise from the combined nature of my role as Director General for Health and Social Care and Chief Executive of NHS Scotland. Scotland is not unique in this. Equivalent arrangements exist in Wales and Northern Ireland, and in March this year, Wes Streeting announced the integration of NHS England with the Department for Health and Social Care, commenting that its previous separation had caused duplication of responsibilities. But of course, there must be clarity of responsibilities and appropriate and transparent scrutiny of the discharge of my responsibilities. As Audit Scotland note, there is a role for non-executive directors here to enhance the oversight of performance, risk and financial management that is already built into the overall Scottish Government governance structures. In conclusion, Convener, we're keen to use this report and to continue to work with Audit Scotland to ensure that our governance arrangements fully support the ambitions set out in the Service Renewal Framework and the Population Health Framework, providing the strategic direction and coherence needed to deliver a more sustainable, person-centred and community-focused health and care system. I look forward to answering the committee questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Can I begin with what is a fairly stock question, which I'm quite sure you're expecting, which is to ask you whether you accept the findings and the recommendations which are contained in this report?
Yes, we accept the findings and recommendations, and we are actively working to implement those recommendations. Yeah,
because 5 are exclusively targeted at you, the Scottish Government,
yep,
and 3 are targeted at you, the Scottish Government, along with NHS boards, both territorial and otherwise.
Yep.
So, I mean, could you tell us a little bit about the progress you've made? Because this report came out in May. We're now 5 months later. We will go into some detail in each of the areas of the recommendations, but could you give us an overall picture of where you have made progress and how you have been able to implement each of these 8 recommendations?
Yes, sure. Just going through them, I think probably what I would say is that the first recommendation, as you know, is around the operation of the NHS Scotland Executive Group. Particular recommendation there is the refresh of the framework document, which, as I've said, we completed, and that has been issued in June this year. We are working, I'll come back a bit to say more on the NHS Scotland Executive Group, or you might want to pick that up in questions. You'll have questions for that. Okay, I won't cover that just now then. In terms of the learning and evaluation framework, yes, as I've said, we are still at relatively early stages in terms of setting up our overall structures for delivering the service renewal framework, and we are absolutely looking at how we evaluate the outcomes of that along the way. We are looking at how we can engage non-executive directors across those governance groups, and I can say a bit more about those governance groups and how they've been set up to reflect the way in which the frameworks were developed as well. We have looked at our sponsorship arrangements. We've made some clarifications to that through the new framework arrangement that's already been published, but we will continue to keep those sponsorship arrangements under review, particularly in terms of looking to ensure that we are taking a whole system approach to how we review the performance of different aspects of the system. And as you know, we changed the remuneration relating to non-executive chairs and appointments, and that we're still in the earlier days of that, but I'm sure you will have questions you want to pick up about how we attract and recruit chairs and indeed non-executives. In relation to our work with boards, obviously boards have specific responsibilities in terms of the engagement of their local populations and looking to work with underrepresented groups. So we're continuing to look at that, and we've obviously now established the National Care Service Advisory Board, which deliberately brings in the voice of lived experience into that advisory role and ensuring that sort of fits into our overall governance. We are also looking at what are the mechanisms whereby we will review the blueprint for good governance, but also that external validation of that. And we've been using the Healthcare Governance Advisory Board to provide us some initial input into the mechanisms in which we might seek to do that. And as I've already recognised in my opening statement, we're keen to ensure that the next iteration of the blueprint for good governance provides more sort of operational clarity. Have I missed any there?
No, I think that's a pretty comprehensive start. That was great. That was a really useful introduction. And as I say, members of the committee will have more questions in each of those areas. Can I just ask you about this population-based planning approach? Because in the note in the report, I think it's paragraph 24. The Auditor General concludes the Scottish Government have yet to confirm how this population-based planning will operate. Where are we then with how that proposed, how that way of planning health services has been developed. What stage are you at with that?
Sure. So one of the things I'd say is that planning on a population level is not entirely a new thing. We already do that for a number of services, and we have established mechanisms for doing that, particularly through the way in which we use National Services Scotland. But the ambition set out in the SRF was intended to take that a bit further. And so, as I've already referenced, we also signalled in that a review of NHS board accountabilities, and we have been working through the course of the summer to establish what that might look like in terms of how we might move to plan differently and to really sort of reinforce that process of collaboration across boards. And we expect to be in a position to be able to issue some where we've got to with that relatively soon. I'd be very happy to write to the committee once we've got it to that point.
Okay, but just to try to summarise your answer to that question, then, you still have yet to confirm how this will operate.
So I think what I would say, and I'll maybe ask Christine to come in just on how we've been working with the boards, particularly around planned care. So what we've been doing so far is very much working within the structures that we already have and just pushing those, if you like, a bit further away from just mutual aid being offered to boards to how we can be more deliberate in how we seek to use the resources across the whole of Scotland and how we can blur those territorial boundaries so that we're ensuring that people across Scotland are getting the same or equivalent service. So we've been learning from that process. What we're now seeking to do is to think about, well, how we can move forward in terms of looking to plan our activity, particularly as we go into 26, 27 and get into that planning cycle, how we would approach that differently. And that will require different guidance, and that's what we've been working on through the course of the summer. But Christine, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, so Convener, the guidance that was issued that relates to this report was issued in November 2024, and that led to so very specific there about that duty to collaborate and to plan on a population basis. The way that was taken forward initially was through a number of specialties. And so areas like vascular and oncology, for example, there's about 6 specialties where work has actually been taken forward on a population basis. So a strategic needs assessment for the whole of the country, National Services Division within National Services Scotland leading on that planning work for a target operating model across the whole country. So there has been progress since that letter was issued to the service for those specific specialties. Some of them are concluded, vascular is a bit further on, others are still in progress. So that first stage definitely has had progress, and we can provide more information on that if that would be helpful. But then, as Caroline says, the service renewal framework then takes us further in our ambition and what we would do there. But we do have specific examples of those Scotland-wide population-level plans for specific specialties, but not all specialties.
Yeah, I mean, if you could give us that as by way of follow-up, I think that would be useful to us. The other area I just wanted to touch on before I bring in other members of the committee was, and you spoke about it in your opening remarks and then in answering my first question, was about the NHS Scotland Executive Group. I mean, you'll be aware that when we took evidence on the 11th of June, Alison Cumming from Audit Scotland said, and I'll quote her, our objective assessment is that it can be difficult to make decisions when large numbers of people are around the table. How do you respond to that?
So I don't think it's so much about the numbers of people around the table, but the sort of shared intent. And the NHS Scotland Executive Group includes all of our NHS boards and some members of my directorate. So it's a big group, but it's not an enormous group. The group is also very focused on ensuring that it has mechanisms that sit below it as a structure where work can be done, work can be carried out, and we can engage clinicians, others as necessary in terms of some of the recommendations that come forward to the executive group. The executive group has been established to support us working more collaboratively across NHS Scotland. And I think one of the challenges has been, and maybe what Alison was referring to, is that there can be circumstances where groups come together and agree that something is the right thing to do in principle, but then it becomes very hard to implement in terms of people making that happen in their own boards. In the NHS Scotland Executive Group, we've been really clear in the terms of reference that the group is there to make decisions. That applies particularly to things that should be done on a national or a once for Scotland basis, and that there is then a feedback loop. So it's the responsibility of the NHS chief executives sitting on that group to make sure that their boards are fully briefed about the things that are being discussed, and then to take those decisions back into their boards. And if the boards have concerns about the implementation of those decisions, then there is a feedback loop back into the NHS Executive Group in order to ensure that things that we have agreed collectively should be actioned, that we are picking up any challenges to actually actioning those and resolving them in that group. So one of the things that it's been looking at is the implementation of business systems across NHS Scotland, and there has been substantial progress made in that process through having that group, through a really sort of genuinely working together approach, and having, importantly, those feedback loops.
And how many people are on the executive group?
So in terms of the people who sit round the table, all NHS boards are represented. 22 plus from our directorate, probably about 5.
Yeah, I was going to say maybe upwards to about 13.
30 max, probably.
Okay. And again, just to understand, are you saying it's an NHS Scotland executive group, or it's an NHS Scotland group of executives?
So we call it the NHS Scotland Executive Group. It includes all the chief executives plus directors from the health and social care.
But is it a decision-making body?
Yes, it's a decision-making body on behalf of NHS Scotland about the actions that need to be taken to deliver against ministerial priorities.
Okay. And again, we may probe into this a little bit more as we go along in the session. I'm going to invite Keith Brown to put some questions to you. Keith.
Didn't really expect that, but there you go.
Life is full of surprises, Keith.
There you go. Yeah, in relation to what you've just been talking about, and you've referred a couple of times already to accountability. Just from the public's point of view, if they watch First Minister's questions every week, and I'm sure you'll have to do that as well, whether you want to or not, and all they'll see is questions being put to the First Minister quite legitimately about issues in the health service. Where do you think they see the accountability of 22 different health boards? Do they see that at all, or do they just see it as the government is responsible here?
So I think it's very hard for me to comment on what the public sees as the accountability for health boards, but clearly NHS boards, health boards are responsible and accountable for delivery of health services in their geographical area, in the case of territorial boards, and obviously the national boards have different functions. And when it comes to give the example of if a member of the public has a concern about the quality of healthcare or about anything related to their healthcare, then their first port of call is the NHS board delivering services in their area. And we would expect that it is up to NHS boards to deal with issues as they arise, and also to provide the information that enables local people to understand how those services are being delivered.
Yeah, it's just, in my experience, if somebody's got an issue with the health board or with health services in their area, the last people they go to be the health board. They might access the complaint system, they might go to councillors or MSPs, but they don't really, the health board doesn't really feature, unless it's something like a closure of a hospital or something like that. The health board doesn't really feature at all, and that's my point. Is it just the case that that's a needless layer of, and I suppose it's very difficult for you to comment on this because it's down to government policy, but does the current configuration of 22 health boards, a number of which the public don't even know that exist, add to accountability in any way?
So I think it's really important that the public have the local leaders, are able to go to the local leaders of their health services and be able to get a response from them. So, and actually, I don't have the data in front of me, we can certainly get it, but we do have patient opinion metrics that then enable us to see and enable health boards to see that people can go online and can comment on the quality of the health services that they're getting, whether that be positive or negative, and that's quite a pretty well used service. So I think I would question whether most people don't know who their health board actually is. I think they're pretty well established in terms of those territorial relationships, and it is really important that there is that local accountability for the delivery of services, as well, obviously, as ministers being held to account for the national policy within which local boards are delivering those services.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's my experience that people do know, they might know the name of the health board. In my area, they would know it's Forth Valley Health Board because there's Forth Valley Hospital, and that's probably why they would know that. But you'd said earlier when you were speaking about, I forget how you termed it, but basically the attempt to make sure that across the country the standard of service that people receive is the same. Often it's called for in terms of local government, which ignores the fact that you've got 32 different mandates in local government, which is not the case in the health service. But is that not another negation of the idea that you need to have 22 health boards if what you're trying to achieve, quite reasonably, is a standard level of service for everybody across the country?
So I think that what we do and what we have been doing consistently over a number of years now is to ensure that we have mechanisms whereby we can identify where there are variations across the country and where local systems have access to that data and they can investigate those variations themselves. We have an absolute expectation that that's what they do. So I guess it's less about the number of organisations and the structures. I think it's about the processes that you have both to identify where there are differences. And also, I think I talked about blurring boundaries across territorial boards earlier, and I think that's really important in terms of the work that we've been doing to make sure that the resources that we have across Scotland in our healthcare system are being used to maximum effect. You'll be aware of the work that we've done around national treatment centres, but the work that we've been doing recently goes further than that in terms of making sure that we are able to use the resources that we have across Scotland to provide treatment in the most timely way that we can to people across Scotland.
So how would you justify the blurring of boundaries as opposed to the elimination of boundaries? Why is the blurring the right way to go?
So I think that, as I've said already, we're working within the construct that we have, and I think that what we are focused on is ensuring that services are delivered in the best way possible, being, and where necessary, blurring those boundaries rather than wholesale organisational change that tends to involve a huge amount of disruption and potentially taking the eye off the ball in relation to actually delivering the services that people need.
My last question really is about comparative evidence. What comparisons do you carry out? I mean, the obvious ones would be with Wales, Northern Ireland and England. In various areas, so we've talked about it in relation to attracting the right number of candidates to go into NHS boards. What are the lessons that could be drawn from what happens down south? Although apparently in Wales the lesson to be drawn is do what Scotland does. We heard that earlier on. But what do you do in terms of comparisons with elsewhere in the UK to give yourself a sense check of what the issues are and how well you're dealing with them, particularly in relation to staffing and getting the right personnel in?
Yeah, so we have a number of, first of all, we have obviously sources of information. We could look at the data that is published across all of the UK nations and look to compare how Scotland is doing against those at an individual policy team level as well. Policy teams, so our health workforce team engage very regularly with the workforce team in the Department of Health and Social Care to understand what our profile is looking like as opposed to and whether we are facing similar challenges or whether there are quite different challenges and the extent to which those are driven by different geographies. We also meet as a Four Nations group to just really discuss those key challenges that we're all facing and to share intelligence and ideas and things that different nations are doing to try and address those issues. So there is quite a lot of engagement goes on.
Would you say it was systematic or?
I think it's relatively systematic in relation to the published data, because we get asked questions about it, about what's happening around different things. I think it's some of that engagement at team-to-team basis will always depend on how good those relationships are. They're pretty good at the moment. I would say they're pretty strong.
If there's not too much of a surprise, I'll hand back to you, Convener.
OK, thanks very much, Keith. I'm now going to turn to Colin Beattie to ask some further questions around the Audit Scotland report.
Thank you, Convener. There's a couple of areas I'd like to just touch on, the new framework and sponsorship arrangements. The government introduced a model framework that's helped provide better clarity, I suppose, between the Scottish Government and territorial NHS boards. And I think that's been mostly welcomed. In the case of individual NHS boards, is there a conflict between national strategies and targets and local priorities and deliveries? And how is that bridged?
So I don't think there should be a conflict between national strategies and targets. I think that if you, certainly when we meet with NHS chief executives and all the process that we went through of engaging with our health board leaders and wider system leadership in the process of developing the population health framework and the service renewal framework, I don't think anybody was disagreeing with the general direction of travel and the things that we were articulating as our priorities. I think that what we try to do is to ensure that local priorities can be managed alongside those, because there will be different priorities, there will be different nuances of priorities according to the demographics in a particular area. And obviously the integrated joint boards have a role in that as well, in terms of having that sort of detailed strategic, excuse me, it's easy for me to say, strategic needs assessment of what is required locally. So I think we try to manage that to ensure that there isn't a particular conflict.
And how do you actually physically monitor that to make sure there isn't any sort of conflict or divergence?
So I think what we have available to us, obviously, a huge amount of data that we use for monitoring purposes. So we use that data in terms of monitoring what is happening against those national targets, but we can do that at a board-by-board level as well. So we see the national picture and then we see what's happening at a board-by-board level. And we also have really regular engagement. So Christine can talk about the engagements that we have with boards to understand where there are any challenges that might arise for a variety of reasons, but might actually be down to that maybe slight difference between national and local priorities. But Christine, do you want to say something about the level of engagement with boards?
Yeah, just going back to the framework document, Mr. Beattie, you see the planning and delivery cycle in there, so that there is a clear commission from Scottish Government to all of the boards that they'll then plan against local service delivery, but against the commission from Scottish Government, and then in-year performance reviews. So I'll just be kicking off in-year reviews with each of the boards over the next few months to understand where they are with progress, and that's where you really get the understanding of how a board will then be implementing that the clear national direction. And probably a really good example now that we've got for this year the operational improvement programme, the 17 actions in that. All boards report very clearly in their own governance structures on their progress against each of those 17 actions, and then we can report through to Caroline and into the executive team and government on that. So there is, I think, probably more clarity than maybe we had in previous years on that, because of the agreeing those documents on behalf of the whole of the country. But there can still be local variation on that in terms of the speed at which boards are implementing things. Implementing the theatre scheduling tool, for example, is being taken forward depending on the readiness in individual boards. So the main thing for us, I think, is to understand that and be comfortable with the variation in boards, knowing that you're going to get to the end point that you need everywhere. So that's a balance, I think, in how we take it forward.
So would you say that the framework actually helps with aligning national policies and local planning?
Definitely really clear, I think, this year, and that there is a very, very strong alignment. And Caroline talked about the executive group. The executive group has now had a clear change in the structure on the agenda, so that we have a section on areas to do with the operational improvement plan, population health framework and the service renewal framework. The chief executives also have their own work plan for the year that covers all of those areas, so that they can report back to us on progress. So I think that feels to me probably a strengthened position over the last year.
And just moving on to the slightly more difficult area of sponsorship. This committee has come across sponsorship failures again and again and again in various areas of the public sector that we've received reports from the Auditor General in. How is the sponsorship system working? Does it have adequate oversight of the individual boards, and how does this relate to interventions and escalations that have obviously been taking place?
Yeah, so I would say that the relationship in health between the department and the delivery system is very much closer than maybe in some other areas. And Christine's described that sort of planning and delivery cycle in terms of us being really clear about what we need boards to deliver, and then having really robust systems in place to ensure delivery against that, both in performance terms, but also in terms of use of resources as well. And we have, I think, well-established arrangements that can always be strengthened, and the publication of the refreshed framework has been a part of that, in terms of being really clear about roles and responsibilities, and really regular engagement as well. So there's a really regular reporting cycle from the boards into Scottish Government. We speak really regularly to the boards, not just through the meeting structure that you've heard about, but also where there are issues that arise, there would be really regular engagement with boards. And then, as you've referenced yourself, over and above that, we also have the support and improvement framework, which is designed to be really clear and transparent about the points at which we would trigger an escalation on that framework, and what the support and improvement that accompanies that to support boards. Because the whole point of the support of improvement framework is to enable boards to get de-escalated and to get out of that framework as well.
In the light of what you're saying, I look at the Auditor General's report, and he's fairly clear that sponsorship arrangements have not been applied consistently, and some boards are reporting closer relationships than others. Now, I guess that's a code for, in some cases, the relationship's not working so well.
So I think that probably what it is code for is that there has been a difference in sponsorship relationships between the approach to our national boards and to the territorial boards. And that's really because the national boards tend to sit within different policy areas in Scottish Government. So, for example, NHS Education for Scotland is sponsored by Health Workforce. And I think one of the things that the territorial boards have noted is that it has felt sometimes like because the national boards have a closer sponsorship arrangement than the territorial boards have had. And that's one of the things that we've been seeking to address in terms of the framework, but also how we continue to develop our sponsorship arrangements. Do you want to say anything?
Yeah, so I think it's an area that I've been in post for 4 months, and that area sits within my responsibility, and it is something that just needs to keep evolving with the circumstances that we've got. So I think the framework is a really good, clearly set out description of roles and responsibilities, and there's no doubt that will help us going forward. But so I mentioned before about things like having in-year reviews with all of the boards. You'll know that we have annual reviews through the boards as well. So there are also mechanisms, as well as day-to-day conversations, where we are working across all of the whole system as well. We've also, over the last year, introduced regional meetings that the Cabinet Secretary chairs every month. So we have a North region, East and West. The Chief Executives come together for a discussion with the Cabinet Secretary on how they are collaborating as a system as well. So there are quite a few different layers on sponsorship. It's not just one thing that we do. It's not just the procedural areas, but there's day-to-day conversation that I will, in any given day, be speaking to a number of different boards on different issues, as well as very formal meetings that we have. So I think if anybody now was to, if I was reading that in a year's time, I would be concerned, because what we're doing just now, I hope, gives us really good coverage across the whole of the country. But maybe just finally say, coming back to the point about, is the executive group too big to be effective? One of the things there is that actually having everybody around the table means that nobody is left out of that table, and that's partly, I think, in setting it up, was making sure that everyone had a voice on that too. So it's not something I recognise right now, I would say, in terms of my engagement with the boards. It doesn't feel like it's disproportionate across the country. It's very much about particular issues and challenges across the country. And I engage with all boards and all chief executives on things that are priorities for us every day.
You seem to be disagreeing about the inconsistencies of sponsorship arrangements.
I'm not disagreeing personally. I'm just saying that since I've been in post, I've been working really hard to be very consistent and have coverage across the whole country. I'm sure that there were comments that were made to the Auditor General, and would quite like to pick up on that and understand in a bit more detail what those are. I guess I'm just saying that I'm seeking to improve on that position right now.
Do members of the sponsor team actually sit in on board meetings at territorial level?
We don't do it routinely for every board meeting, but when there are particular boards or particular issues, or a board is escalated, we would have more engagement with them than routinely. And the team would also be involved in all the preparation for in-year reviews and annual reviews with each board. So
if they're only intermittently attending board meetings, how do they keep up to date with what's happening? What's that communication line?
So it will be more engaged with boards, I say, that are on a stage 2, 3 or 4 on the escalation framework. But there's a lot of work that goes into the preparation for both annual reviews and in-year reviews. And I say we're also having these monthly regional discussions. So the sponsor team are working with all of those boards in preparation to understand the situational updates for each board as we go.
What you're saying implies that the sponsor team's only there if there's a problem, as opposed to engaging.
Yeah, the sponsor team though is
before the problem comes to light.
Yeah, the sponsor team is one part of coordination. So all of the teams across the DG will be engaging on policy and performance within their particular areas. So teams dealing on waiting times or on unscheduled care will be engaging every single day with their counterparts in the board. So I wouldn't want you to think that it's only the sponsorship team that engage with boards. There are discussions going on across all of the policy areas, whether it's on primary care, elective care, mental health. That all happens across all of the teams on a very regular basis.
I guess where I'm coming from on this is that in a number of cases across the public sector, there's been a governance failure, and that governance failure seems to consistently be linked to sponsorship not being as effective as it should be and not engaging. And my concern is that I realise there's lots of different parties involved in this. The NHS is a big, complex beast. But if the sponsorship teams are only engaging where there is an issue, or focusing where there's an issue, then how do they act as a tripwire to pick up problems and give that guidance and advice and input that would help get past that, so it doesn't appear as an exception for the Auditor General?
So I think that, as Christine said, we are engaging on multiple levels with boards. So, Christine's talked about the work that the teams in her area do. We would also have our workforce team would be regularly engaging with boards. Our mental health team are regularly engaging with boards. So we do have, and we have a huge amount of data that we're monitoring in terms of trends and variations. So I think we are never complacent about any of this, but I think we are well placed in terms of having that overall system. To give you an example, weekly data coming through around some of many of our performance areas that people are reviewing on a weekly basis, and then talking to their, as Christine said, their counterparts in boards to understand actually what's happening on the ground. So I think we are reasonably well placed in terms of operating a system of no surprises. And again, we continue to refine those processes and continue to look at what are the other areas that what are the areas that we might need to spend more time on.
But the feedback from the smaller NHS boards seems to be that they see the sponsorship relationship as not being as good as it should be.
And as Christine said, we are doing what we can. We are very focused on improving that. I think there have been differences in the past between that sort of felt to be sort of more holistic relationship of one of the national boards with their sponsors, because it is a slightly different relationship. But I think the arrangements that we put in place through the framework and that Christine continues to work on with her team, as she said, I would hope that if you ask that question a year from now, there would be more recognition through some of the work we're putting in place that actually there is more of a consistent approach to sponsorship across the piece.
Thank you. Thank you, Mina.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm now going to turn to the Deputy Convener, who's got some questions to put in a slightly different area, but one that's pretty central to the report that we're looking at. Jamie.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to talk a little bit about governance, particularly around NHS boards and high-level appointments and the boards of the boards, if you like. Ms Lam, you'll obviously be aware of the extremely high turnover in chief executives amongst the territorial boards of the last couple of years. 10 of the 14 territorial NHS boards have had a change at the top. Why do you think that's the case?
So I think part of that is down to demographics and a number of chief executives retiring. So actually, I think my figures over the last 2 years are 12, and then that was 8 retirements. And out of that, out of the 12, that's 8 people who have retired, and that's one of the fluctuations we need to deal with. But also what happens when we have vacancies in chief executives across NHS boards is that people will be promoted into roles in bigger boards. So then 4 of those vacancies were caused by people applying for and being successful and being appointed to chief executive roles in other boards.
Is that a good thing? We talked a little bit in the last session. I don't know if you watched. Did you watch the session we had with the Ethical Commissioner?
No.
Okay, I think you'd find it very enlightening. We talked in great detail about this subject, and the point was raised, perhaps by other members, around whether people just jumping from one board to another could be seen as either a revolving door or a reward for failure, or some sort of cosy club of chief executives that just move on for more money to another board and leave others in the lurch.
So I think there's 2 separate things here, aren't there? There's one is the appointment of chief executives, and the other is the appointment of NHS board chairs, the non-executive roles. And actually, what I'm going to say probably applies to both of those as well. But when it comes to either of those appointments, we have a very clear and robust appointments process. Because we are interested in getting the best people that we can, who meet the criteria and who also can demonstrate that they the NHS values, that they work in accordance with the NHS values. So there is a very robust process. There is no sort of automatic revolving door or anything like that. There is a very robust process around all of that. With chief executives, as I've said, you know, we go through sort of natural phases where we have more retirals than we might have in another period. And I think what's important there is not just that robust process, but also the fact that we are able to attract people into those roles. So I think of the numbers that we've recruited, something like 5 were appointed through from other, let me just check my numbers actually, of the chief executives. So 4 people were promoted into new posts during that period. We had 5 who came either from having been at executive director level in NHS boards or indeed working in integrated joint boards as well, so some chief officers. 1 from the wider public service and 2 from NHS England. So that is a good mix of people who have demonstrated that they have got the skills and experience and values and competencies to be able to do those roles. With chairs, it's equivalent, and I'm sure the Commissioner will have talked to you about the robust process that is in place, both in terms of any public appointments. But there's that is a robust process for chairs to go through. And if a chair at the end of their terms of office wants to apply for as chair in another board, then they have to go through exactly that same recruitment process.
That's very helpful. You just mentioned that the high level of turnover amongst NHS chief executives is due in large part to retirement. So if I read that correctly, in the last 2 years, 8 of the 14 NHS board chief executives left due to retirement. Is that just unfortunately bad coincidences, or is it just spectacularly bad planning?
So I suppose what that reflects is that 8 out of 22 were of a demographic that meant that over that period they were in a position to step down. I think it would be incredibly challenging to try to plan out your chief executive so that you were not going to get retirals, not least in terms of age discrimination and other factors. So I don't think it's bad planning.
Okay, just a coincidence then. Okay. We've also seen a lot of turnover though at IJBs as well. Audit Scotland reported that over half of them have had a turnover of senior leadership positions with either their chief officer or chief financial officers in the year 23-24. Over half of them had changes at that level. Was that also retirements, or was that people leaving? Were they retirements? Was it people moving on in other parts of the health system, or were people sacked for poor governance? Or
I have a direct engagement in the recruitment of NHS chief executives, but I don't have a direct engagement in the recruitment of chief officers to IJBs. So I'm less able to comment on that. What I do know is that when I talked about the 5 coming from executive roles, and I could try and do a quick calculation in my head, but it's probably easier if I write to you afterwards, because I can tell you how many of those the people leaving IJBs actually went into the health service to work as chief executives in the health service. I'm not sure it was complete 5, but it was probably not far off.
So it sounds like there's a bit of movement within professionals within the Scottish Health Service or health and social care arena who will go from, for example, an IJB to either an executive role within an NHS board, or from one board to another, or as in a management position of a board into a board, as in a non-exec board. Again, I can see why there may be benefits to that, people with experience and knowledge of how things are done in other parts. But equally, does that also perhaps point to some problematic areas where, you know, people are just simply moving problems around? They're just, you know, they perhaps, you know, failed in one part of the service and are just moving to another, or equally, is that a predicament that we just don't have enough new blood coming in from outside of Scotland into the Scottish Health Service? So
I particularly welcome the fact that 2 of the appointments that we've made in that period have come in from NHS England. Okay. I think it is important that people who are leading our health and social care systems have good experience and knowledge of leading not just complex systems, but understanding some of the particular complexities around health and social care. And therefore, I think that movement from leading IJBs as chief officers into healthcare systems, again, I welcome that, because that's bringing people into the system who have had that sort of direct, very close experience of running integrated care systems as well. And I think that's important in terms of how we are seeking to develop our health and social care system, that we are recruiting people who have got that good experience. And actually, the colleagues that we've recruited from England bring good experience in running health and social care systems, but also some experience of doing that in a slightly different system as well.
And what due diligence takes place to ensure that people aren't brought into a health board where the board that they've previously run or been an integral part of running has been underperforming either operationally, clinically or financially? Do you think those are the sorts of people you want in other health boards?
Scotland is a relatively small system, as I say. I think we understand we understand how the system is performing as a whole, and we also understand, obviously, where boards are escalated and where they're not escalated. So there is always due diligence in terms of taking up references, understanding where people have dealt with challenging environments and challenging issues in their previous boards as well.
I guess I'll maybe ask a more direct question. Do you think it's appropriate if someone is chief executive of or chair of the non-executive board of an NHS board which is under special measures, for example, that they should be allowed to apply for a job in another NHS board? Is that a sign of success in their role?
So when you say special measures, we don't have special measures in Scotland, so we have the escalation framework, and I think we would look at candidates on their merit.
Right. Has anyone who's run a board that's had such high-level escalation?
So our high-level escalation is levels 4 and 5, and I cannot think of an instant where somebody has moved from a level 4 board into another board.
Okay. That's good to know. Maybe
but we will check that.
Yeah, please do. Please write to us. I guess that the wider question is, if somebody is very close to the system, when we talked in the earlier session a little bit about the importance of the role of the non-executive board and holding the executive to account in any public body or organisation, if someone has been very much part and parcel of that organisation for a long period of time, whilst I can see that they may bring knowledge and experience of that sector to their non-exec role, but are they just simply too close to it and the people involved in it to be able to hold them properly to account in terms of governance arrangements?
So I think that our maximum term of appointment for non-executives in any particular non-executive role is 8 years. So that would be 2 terms of office of 4 years. And at the end of the first term of office, if that person is interested in being appointed for a further term of office, then that involves a level of scrutiny through the annual appraisal process and then a recommendation being made as to whether that's an appropriate action to take. And it's not automatic.
We also heard in the last session a lot about some of the struggles that some of our more rural boards have in recruiting people. Indeed, the convener gave an excellent example of one board where some of the board members do not live in or had never been to the board. Clearly, it is more difficult in a wide range of public bodies to recruit in more rural and highland and island areas. But how important is it that these people have local knowledge and understanding of the complexities of delivering health services outside of the central belt?
So I think that it's really important that we have a balance across our board. So we need the people with the right skills and experience, but we also need people who have an understanding of the local context and the local circumstances. And therefore, it's important. I think the Scottish Government has a role to play in terms of our advertising and promotion of these roles. But also, the local boards have a lot they can do, particularly in our rural and island communities. And certainly, I've had conversations with the chairs in all of our island boards about the work that they're doing just to try and engage local people, to encourage local people to apply to become non-exec members of those boards.
Yep, we heard some good examples of that again as well, which is great. There is, however, an issue. There's a 25% failure rate on the first round recruitment at the highest level. That's 1 in 4 vacancies. That's an extremely high number relative to other parts of the public sector. Why is it so bad?
Yeah, so we did experience, I would say that, again, I need to check the percentages, but that was probably, I think from memory, that was over a period where there was a relatively low number of appointments. But we did experience challenges in recruiting to 2 particular health boards, and I think at that time we were already looking at how we could make appointments to non-exec positions in total, but also particularly to those chair positions, which are the high profile. One of the things we recognised was that their remuneration was not comparable to other public bodies who with a similar sort of remit, and therefore we took that through the Scottish Government Remuneration Committee. They've now been approved as Tier 1 public bodies, and so that issue around remuneration is being addressed. We also recognise that many of the chairs are reporting that the time commitment in practice is significantly more than in the terms and conditions, and we're doing a bit of work to review that at the moment. We've also, I think, been working very hard with the Commissioner about how we can spread the net more widely as well, and how we can attract people into chairs positions who maybe wouldn't have thought about the role of an NHS chair previously, but also people into the non-exec director positions who can then be further developed into because obviously they then become part of the pipeline for aspiring chairs. And we have had more success in our most recent recruitment rounds. Also, actually, the commissioners themselves who sit on the panels have been very supportive in terms of providing advice and guidance about organisations that we can contact and ask them to use their networks to promote those opportunities as well.
Yeah, the Aspiring Chairs programme was mentioned, and it seems to be reaping some degree of success as a pipeline generation of new entrants and bringing people up the chain. That's particularly helpful. But the issue of time commitments and remuneration were first brought up in the 2021 survey, and so we're 4 years on from that. Those are not new issues, I suppose. So yet many boards are still struggling.
Yes, and I think that given that position was resolved last year, so we have now resolved that, and the remuneration, as I've said, is now at Tier 1, and it's hard to gauge how much that's having an impact on the improvement in recruitment that we're seeing, and how much it's down to other factors. But I have no doubt that is a factor in the fact that those roles have become more attractive.
Yeah, good. Okay. I guess my last question is maybe looking for your observation. I think I know what the answer will be, but is it the case that we are struggling to get so many candidates to fill these board positions? Is because there are simply too many boards?
I think it's hard to say that that's because there's too many boards. I think that there is, if you look at the public sector across Scotland, we are recruiting to a lot of public bodies. So I don't think it's about necessarily just boards. It's about that level of expertise across Scotland. But we're actually looking for 200, and I think we've got 251 non-execs across boards. So it's not a huge number in terms of setting it against the Scottish population, and I think the important thing there is for us to try and continue our efforts to improve diversity. Certainly a number of our boards have been doing really good work in attracting younger members onto the boards as well, which is really important too.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Convener.
OK, thank you. I'm going to move on to Graham Simpson. Before I do, can I just ask, in a follow-up to Jamie Green's line of question, are there any examples of board chairs applying for reappointment for a second term and being refused?
Yes, I can think of one.
OK.
But sorry, I think we just need to be really clear on that. I think there is a difference between there are examples of board chairs who will have gone through a recruitment process after the end of normally their 8-year term of office and may not have been successful. Off the top of my head, I'm trying to think. There will also, I am sure, be examples where chairs might have been keen to be reappointed, but that wasn't felt to be the right thing.
Having gone through the process, or informally told that they wouldn't be successful if they applied for a second term?
So the process at the end of the first 4-year term is essentially a discussion around the appraisal conversation about how things have been going and whether it works two ways. One is the chair willing to be put forward for reappointment, and two is taking into account the performance over the period. Does that look like an appropriate route to take?
Okay. Graham Simpson might pursue some of these lines of questioning, but Graham, over to you. You ask the questions you want to ask.
Right. Thank you very much, Convener. I guess sort of following on from that, I gave the example earlier from the area that I represent and the convener represents. We've got an example of the former chair of Lanarkshire Health Board has moved and is now the chair of Forth Valley Health Board. And I put it to the commissioner that might be inappropriate, and he seemed to think that wasn't the best situation. What do you make of that? I mean, is that not just an example of how we're struggling to fill positions? And wouldn't it be better if, we could have got somebody different? That's not to cast aspersions on the chair, who is a fine woman, and Richard and I have worked with her over many years. It's just, it doesn't seem right.
So maybe if I can just add a bit of context to that. So, first of all, if my memory serves me correctly, and we will correct you if it doesn't, I think that the chair of NHS Lanarkshire, who's now chair of Forth Valley you referred to, stood down as chair of NHS Lanarkshire in 2021. So there was quite a gap before that person was then appointed to Forth Valley. So I don't think it's a question of somebody just moving from one board to another board. It's about somebody actually standing down as chair and then coming back into our system. And I'm pleased to recognise that you both know she is a very experienced chair, and I'm really pleased that she made the decision to come back into the system.
Yeah, well, that's a good point, and we've got no complaints about her at all. And I think you've put on the record that there was a gap, so that's good. You mentioned remuneration, and you said that you've moved. I wasn't quite clear whether it was one board or all boards into Tier 1.
So all boards have moved to the same tier. There is a different level depending on which boards within which boards. But in terms of Scottish Government's overall remuneration for non-executives on public bodies, the NHS, I think, was in Tier 2 and has now moved into Tier 1.
So does that mean that board chairs, for example, are now being paid more than they were being paid?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes.
The figure we were given earlier was around about £30,000 for 2 days' work. Does that sound right to you?
Off the top of my head, probably, but let me come back to you on that one. It's in the pack somewhere.
Okay.
I think Fiona Bennett might be able... Fiona Bennett, I don't know whether you can answer that question, Fiona.
Hi, yes. So it's a day rate that the chair role is advertised on, so that is sort of extra. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, so it's a day rate that the chair role is advertised on, so that's then extrapolated up, which roughly comes to that 30,000 figure, but there's 3 rates for a chair depending on the size of the board and the budget that board has, so we can provide that in writing as well, but both the non-execs and chairs are set at a day rate, which is then extrapolated up to roughly that number that was given earlier.
Right, that's useful. Yeah. Good to hear from you, Fiona. So do we Yeah, do the better remunerated boards find it easier to attract people?
I don't think that that necessarily applies, because the boards the boards where the remuneration is at the highest rate are the biggest and most complex boards. So the variation in rates reflects the complexity of the chair's role.
Okay. I'm going to ask you now about the blueprint for good governance.
Yep.
If that's okay. I'm just going to quote from paragraph 71 of the Auditor General's report, which says that, I'm quoting here, while the blueprint is a useful resource for driving improvement in governance, it's not clear if the self-assessment process is sufficient to identify those boards where things are not working as well as they should. What would your comment be on that?
So I think that is fair comment. We have been working to look to, I suppose, identify the differences across those self-assessments, and from the data we can see that there is a variation between the number of areas for improvement that boards identify, and sometimes it's quite easy to recognise the reasons for that because of what we understand about and what we know about where boards are on the escalation framework, as an example. But I think that, as you'll be aware, the blueprint for good governance was first developed pre-pandemic. It was then updated post-pandemic. Boards have just been through their first process of self-assessment against that. I think in terms of our future development, and as I think I said in my opening statement, we would want to start to look at how we can best bring in some external validation for that. Christine, right. do you want to say any more on that one?
Yeah, so that's definitely our next step, is to look at that, and it's the next meeting. You'll know in the report as well that there's a governance advisory group that we've got as well to take questions to, and that's been put to that group. So our next meeting in November, we want to just look at different options and how best to get the best results from external assessment of those individual board self-assessments. So that's active work just now that's ongoing.
So is it going to happen?
Yes.
Yeah, it is. Right. Because self-assessment is obviously marking your own homework.
Yes, although I think we need to be aware that the process of self-assessment is carried out by the board as a whole, and there will be certainly. I don't think we could necessarily make the assumption that all board members will be keen to just say everything's fine. I think board members are really aware of their own responsibilities, and the blueprint provides a really useful framework for them to just really step back and consider how well they're discharging those responsibilities.
Okay. And when can we expect to see the results of that external validation?
I probably want to come back to you because I don't have a date. So what we need to do is scope out what that external assessment would be, and whether we target specific boards or whether we do something comprehensively across all the boards. So I'll use that meeting in November with that advisory group to just get test out some of those options. I'm happy to come back in writing and update committee on what the proposal is, but I'm quite certain that we will be doing a form of external assessment, partly because there's a reason why you said we would do it, which is the points that you raised. But it's also about learning and improve, as well as the assurance bit. It's a learning and improvement across the boards as well, that we want to make sure is in place to supplement the support that comes from NES to all of the boards as well.
Okay. Who would you get to externally validate?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why we're looking for some advice from that group, which brings together Audit Scotland,
SIPFA, and the
Institute of Good Governance.
So there are different options. You can go entirely external to third parties. You can look at something across, bring in a blend of people from across private and public organisations. And I think I'd like to be quite open about how we do it and take it forward. I think the thing that we're quite clear on is that we've committed to doing it. We think it's the right thing to do, and we will put in place a mechanism to do that.
Okay. Now, right at the start, you mentioned 5 core principles. one of which was digital, which gives me the opportunity, as you were expecting, to ask how we're getting on with the app that you keep promising us.
The digital front door.
Yes, that's it.
Yep.
The equivalent of the NHS England app, which I keep mentioning to you, and I'm waiting eagerly for an equivalent in Scotland. Where is it?
So, well, I'll ask Christine to come in on some of the detail here, but what I would just say is that I know you've been waiting eagerly for this, and what I would say is that actually a lot of the, what I think I've described to you before as the plumbing work that has been really important in that, will enable us to go further than the NHS England app, because the KI number that we have in Scotland and the increasing adoption of the use of the KI number by local government will mean that we are in a position to start to link health and care records in a way that is not possible in England. But Christine, do you want to give us an update on where we are with the digital front door?
So there'll be a more substantial update in the coming days, so I will leave that to the Cabinet Secretary to do it. But in terms of the actual first phase of that with NHS Lanarkshire, we're on track to go live in December with the first test of change, which is dermatology outpatients in Lanarkshire, so still very much on track and working through that, what that rollout plan will be for the rest of the country. But as Caroline said, our ambition is its health and so the NHS app, as you'll know, we all know that the great functionality that was in it. It's an NHS app, and our ambition is for it to be health and care. But more detail to come very soon on the wider ambition on that.
Yeah, because the Lanarkshire one isn't it's not what I'm talking about. It's an app that everyone could access. You get your health records.
But
you can
this
make
is us
appointments.
testing out the national app in NHS Lanarkshire. So the first test of change, the first step in that is testing it out in the NHS. So it's not an NHS Lanarkshire app, but the test of the national app is in NHS Lanarkshire in digital in dermatology outpatients, and that's what we'll go live with in December, and then look to roll out across the country.
Right. So I hear what he's saying. The Health Secretary is going to make some kind of announcement. Let's hope it's a good one. When do you anticipate that we'll get what I'm looking for, which is that national app?
Soon.
Soon?
So the details, we're working through the plan right now. I'm not in a position to give the details right now, but that's what we're working on just now, is the plan. So the first phase of that, say, is December, and then we'll announce the rollout following that. Okay, good. I look forward to that. I've just got one more question, Caroline. In July, it was reported that you hadn't visited a hospital in more than a year. Have you since visited a hospital?
So I have been, so just to be really clear about that, I have been in the health boards. I think I have been to, sorry, I would need to check, I would need to go back and check that. But I have been on health board premises. I have been in contact with the health boards. And I've also, I'm just going to say this, in the last year I have given evidence to the UK COVID inquiry 4 times, so that has occupied quite a lot of my time as well. Well, visiting health board premises isn't quite the same. I was hoping you would say, yes, I have been. So I will need to check that. I know I've got a number of appointments coming up in my diary at the moment, so I will just need to check that. The other thing I would say is that when I've been in health boards, so I have met with staff side representatives and patient representatives on all those occasions as well. Okay. I mean, do you not think it's part of your role to get out and about and see what's going on the ground? Yes, I do. And as I say, I'm now out the other end of the UK COVID inquiry, so I will have more time to be able to do that over the course of the next year, and those visits are being planned for me. Okay. Leave it there. OK, right. I don't think we've got any further questions. So can I thank you, Christine McLaughlin, Fiona Bennett, who joined us remotely. Thanks very much for your input this morning. And Caroline Lamb, thank you also for
sharing with us your insights and knowledge about these areas on NHS governance. I think there were a few areas where you said you might come back to us with further detail, and we would very much welcome that. So I am now going to follow the earlier agreement that we reached and move the committee into private session. Thank you very much.